Good evening. I'm Valerie Coleman Morris, in for Belva Davis. Welcome to This Week in Northern California. Joining me on our news panel are Will Reisman, transportation reporter for the San Francisco Examiner, Tom Vakar, consumer editor for KTVU, and Marisa Lagos, political writer for the San Francisco Chronicle. You know, Marisa, the state budget being passed, some people saying, my goodness.
Right, on time.
And on time. But were there still some sticking points? I mean, the governor and the legislature weren't necessarily walking step by step.
No, and this is, the big sort of appropriations bill was passed today. We still have about 20 trailer bills that are going to need to be taken up in the next few weeks. And the big sticking points that the governor and the legislature have been negotiating throughout this week really haven't been resolved. As late as Friday evening, the governor's office was saying, we're not there yet. The biggest issue is CalWorks, the state's welfare to work program. There's questions. The governor really wants to cut it by almost $1 billion. And he would like to see the sort of grant levels be reduced, the amount of time people can stay on this program. Democrats are saying no way. This is after years of cuts, and we don't want to leave people homeless. But yeah, we saw a $92 billion spending plan passed on Friday. There's $8 billion in cuts. They're depending a lot on the governor's tax increases, which will be on the November ballot. And it's not an easy budget. I mean, we're talking about deep cuts to childcare, to things like the state's courtrooms, which have already seen, again, years of cuts. CalGrants, which is the student aid program, if you go to a nonprofit or a for-profit or private university and you start in a year from now, you're going to see much smaller grant levels.
So when we think about the $8 billion in cuts this year, but collective, so much more than that.
Oh yeah, I mean, this has been 5 or 6 years of just, smaller and smaller. A few years ago, the Legislative Analyst's Office had predicted by this point we'd have a $130 billion budget. We're down to $92 billion. And you have to, assume every year the state budget grows whether anything happens or not, just because of inflation and increased cost. So this is definitely a painful place, and it's not some place the Democrats were happy to have it done on time, not so happy to see what they had to do.
Given the fact that this thing is nowhere close to really being done, a lot of people up there is basically saying they did this so they wouldn't lose their pay.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's entirely fair. I do think that because the legislature now has a simple majority requirement to pass a budget, they're able to do this. In the past, what we saw was this would get dragged out through the summer, maybe into the fall, and partly that was because they were trying to just get 1 or 2 Republican minority members to sign on for whatever they were holding them hostage for, regardless whether it was actually, something related to the budget. Of course, they want to get paid, but I think more so the legislature's very conscious of how terrible their approval ratings are and how much they need the public to feel like things are functional up there if they're going to get these taxes passed.
A good point, though, Tom, that you make, because a lot of people said, oh, that was convenient. It satisfied their need. But talk a little bit about the process, because we're not there yet.
No, and I mean, so like every year, the governor comes out in January and presents a budget, but we don't really know what he's looking at until May when we have updated finance forecasts. So they essentially only have a month between May and now to do this, and what they did in the past month, and really throughout the whole year, has been meeting after meeting, hearing after hearing, but the nitty-gritty details were getting hammered out behind closed doors, and that really angered a lot of Republicans who, let's not forget, they don't need now because they have a majority. So we saw Republicans sort of boycott a budget meeting this week, a lot of criticism that this is a closed door sort of no sunshine deal. This was happening when Schwarzenegger was governor too. It's just there was 2 Republicans in the room, not just the 3 Democrats. So it's going to be interesting, I think, to see going forward how the minority party deals with this. Do they just sort of boycott it, or do they try to become relevant in other ways?
And what are people saying? I mean, where's the sentiment with regard to that? Is there going to be cooperation?
I don't think in that realm. I mean, what people are saying, what we're hearing mostly is the sort of criticism from the people who depend on these services. We've seen rallies and protests all week at the Capitol. We've seen a lot of consternation among folks, home care, welfare, students, and those concerns aren't going to go away. If voters turn down these tax increases, there's trigger cuts that would take $5.5 billion from K through 12 schools and another $500 million from higher education. So they're certainly hoping that voters feel that pain and want to keep the numbers up.
If you had to give a bottom line, what should people take away from this? Yes, it was approved on time, quote unquote.
10 hours early. Yeah, it's not over yet. We really won't know exactly what this all looks like until July 1.
We know what a lot of things look like oftentimes because of the conversations among our reporters. Will, for example, there's been so much news this week about transportation, Bay Area mass transit. All right, let's start with the thing that stopped people in their tracks yesterday because of BART.
Yeah, at about 2:15 early Thursday morning, there was a major fire at a senior housing center right next to the West Oakland BART station, and it warped some tracks near the station. And of course, that's the station. That's the last one you pass through on your way to San Francisco from the East Bay. And as a result, BART had to shut down their Transbay service, stranding hundreds of thousands of commuters. Lines of cars for miles and miles meeting into the Bay Bridge toll plazas. Lots of people waiting in line to get board AC transit buses. Ferry service was packed for once. Commuters had very few options. Either you kind of sweated it out in line at an AC transit bus and crowded in with a bunch of people, or you tried to make your way through the Bay Bridge and the tons of traffic that was in there. The regional transit agencies stepped up as much as they could. AC Transit ran extra service. They had about 20 extra buses that they plucked from existing routes they use for Transbay, and the Bay Ferry system increased service. They carried about 4 times as many people. The MTC, which is the region's lead transportation agency, they plucked a couple buses from local transit agencies and got them out to the bridge. But really there was limited options.
The thing, though, that I think was quite amazing is everybody handled it fairly well.
I went down and talked to folks at the Transbay terminal here in San Francisco, and they were going the opposite direction of most people. But lines were moving quickly. The AC Transit officials were really helpful in telling people what bus to go on to. I mean, I think there was people were upset, but there wasn't this outrage that you might have expected. They were kind of just,
Well, it seems like this really demonstrates how much we rely on BART. I mean, I think that you see the lines at the Bay Bridge every morning and assume that so many people are driving, but so many people are relying on BART, right?
I think it's about 60,000 people travel through the Transbay tube between 8 and 10 a.m. 100,000 people in the day. I mean, we live at the tip of a peninsula, and BART is essential to getting folks to San Francisco from the commuting.
But the other thing that's interesting about it is, you look at all these systems, the highway system, you take a look at the bus system, you take a look at the train system, you take a look at BART, and these things are all pretty much at capacity, and it proves one thing, that if you don't have really robust, over-capable transit, what happens is any one thing goes wrong, everything goes haywire. And don't you think that at some point in time people are going to start making the connection that if we don't pay for this robustness, that every time something like this happens, we're likely to end up in the same scenario, which damages the economy, no question about it.
One of the things is that when you talk about transit agencies and their budgets, preventative maintenance and kind of core system funding, that's not very sexy. People don't want to talk about putting money into making sure the trains are serviced regularly. There's a lot of talk about making expansion projects and kind of these flashy things, but really it's hard to get people to realize that if these systems aren't funded properly and they break down, the options are scary.
Well, one of the options that people immediately thought about was get in the car, get into that line, get ready to cross the bridge. And that brings us to the bridge and the controversy, the Sacramento Bee story. And the Sacramento Bee has said, no, they are not going to retract this story. Bring us up to date on what's happening.
There's kind of been dueling rebuttals between CalTrans, the state transportation department that oversees the Bay Bridge construction, and the Sacramento Bee. Today, the CalTrans had this kind of, they're calling it kind of a once in a lifetime webinar where basically they went over in detail. I mean, I don't know if you need it. Exactly. I don't know if it gets the people too excited about hearing webinar, but they basically, in detailed description, went over all their testing for the foundation of the self-anchored suspensions ban on the Bay Bridge. The Sacramento Bee reported that an inspector back in 2007 falsified reports, said that the foundation, this concrete was set when it wasn't. This is what Sacramento Bee is alleging, and there's some data gaps and some other questions about the reporting, and the Bay Bridge has been adamant. They're furious. They want Sacramento Bee to retract everything. They gave a point-by-point bullet point of where these accusations are false, and today the Sacramento Bee countered that and said, no, we stand by our story.
Well, they said they had their experts.
Yeah, they had their independent experts.
And so they have their experts.
Yeah.
It's dueling
Exactly.
experts.
Exactly.
What is the bottom line?
One of the real problems with that, of course, is that many of the experts who would like to talk about this and are probably more qualified to talk about this can't talk about this because they either have an ongoing relationship with CalTrans or they don't want to harm a relationship with CalTrans, which is one of the big hander-outers of contracts that there are.
And it's a small pool, too. I mean, it's like there's not a whole lot of people that can talk. I mean,
yeah, it really becomes, and from all the stories that I've done, there's a real problem here with just openness, and it's not anybody's specific fault. It's just that people are afraid that their livelihoods will be endangered if we just sit out and lay all the cards on the table. The bottom line is the cards are going to be laid out on the table anyhow, because after all of this stuff gets churned and mashed through, we're going to know what the true story is, and the true story seems to be this thing is so overbuilt it'll be okay anyhow.
We have another area, Transportation Week. It has been a busy week indeed. The Central Subway. Construction started this week, but controversy over it has been going on for a very long time.
yeah, there's two pretty stark parties when it comes to the Central Subway, those who don't want to see it built and those who think it's essential. And the construction started today in the Soma, this week in the Soma District, and it's going to be the tunnel that starts this 1.7 mile extension of metro service from the Soma to Chinatown. And one of the big question marks about this project is this $942 million grant application that has been submitted to the MTA, that runs the agency that runs UNI, to the federal government, and they were supposed to hear back from this huge grant, which accounts for 60% of the project cost. They're supposed to hear back from this in December, and then it was February, and now we're here in June. And there's still been no word on when this money is going to release, and the city is investing all this money. They're ripping up the infrastructure to put a tunnel that we don't know if it's going to get funded yet.
It's one of those show me the money, but the federal government hasn't shown it yet.
And that's the thing, they have to show that the city has to show that they're making progress. That reassures the feds that we're making progress. But like the feds are like, okay, you're making progress, but we still haven't given you the money yet. Yeah?
Is there concern locally that the presidential election could affect this? I mean, do they think that a different administration might not be as friendly to these sorts of projects?
I'm sure. I mean, right now, the fact that the House is controlled by Republicans who don't want to invest heavily in this project, that is already a bit of concern for local officials. I think a new administration, one that would, a new administration that doesn't want to spend a lot of money in the small government era would definitely concern them. And for the first time, the Bay Citizen actually put a report out today about emails that were accessed through public records requests, and they showcased local planners who were concerned that this money wasn't going to come through. It was really the first time that you saw the local officials were uneasy about this.
Right. It is an uneasy time for a lot of reasons, but another reason that it's been such an uneasy time is it's fire season.
It sure is.
There are, 19 major fires burning now across the country. We're concerned about fire season right here. We
are. In fact, I was last week talking to a guy by the name of Bob Villette, somebody you maybe never heard of, but he is a tanker pilot, and he's been doing this tanker piloting of the fire retardants for 38 years. He knows what California looks like when it's wet, when it's kind of wet, when it's dry. And he told me last week, I've been doing this 38 years, I've never seen California as dry as it is right now. And that is a pretty big statement. We've already had in California twice as many wildfires as we had last year. In fact, the NOAA, the National Oceanographic Administration, has basically said that 1/5 of the United States right now is either in extreme or severe drought situation. The South Bay, for example, has received 50% of its normal rainfall. The peninsula is 65%, even Oakland, which is right there on the bay, 72%. So what we have is the scenario set up for a really bad fire season, and of course this weekend we will have a red flag warning, at least in the North Bay, if not in other parts, and so there could be some real problems.
Now, Tom, predicting fire season and how it's going to go, I mean, there are some factors that we need to remember. We haven't had a lot of rain. Right. Winds are a factor.
Big factor, and especially when you have winds that are going offshore. When the hot winds, and when it gets so hot in the interior that it blows the winds out to the ocean, those winds are hot, so they not only fan the flames, they fan the flames with hot winds, and that makes the fires even worse.
And you know, it might sound really basic, but I think a lot of times people forget what causes fire. It's not, you know, necessarily someone who's been malicious. It can be some basic things such as using equipment, creating a spark.
Yeah, and the overwhelming majority of wildland fires are caused by lightning.
Right.
And so, you know, and we have this other problem in California, which is true in a lot of states now, and that is this what we call the urban wildland interface, where we build houses not right up to the forest, we build them into the forest. And we allow, and I'll tell you, look at Marin County is a good example. You take a look at Sausalito, you take a look at Mill Valley, and you know, they are the urban forest because the forest has grown up around them after they built the houses. And the Oakland Hills was a perfectly good example of how the urban forest can become a very dangerous thing. So we have to be very, very careful. One interesting point, though, I was talking to a guy who flies in the spotter plane that directs the tankers, and he was saying, you know, it's really interesting. When we really tell people how dangerous things are, and we really tell them this is a red flag, be careful, most people are careful.
That's
he says
great.
It's on those days when it isn't all that threatening that people pay less attention to that, and when they pay less attention, that's when we get the big fires.
So last year's huge amounts of snow isn't helping this at all?
Well, the problem was we had huge amounts of snow, but we had so little rain for so long that a lot of these plants got really dried out, and we've been in kind of a really dry scenario, as I said, from the amount of rain that came in. So now what you have is, in places, you have a lot of, not a lot of growth, but what you have is a lot of dryness. And in year after year after year of growth dry, that's a scenario for big fire.
You know, Tom, people hear the term global warming. And sometimes people don't understand that everything that we've been talking about now is part of it.
Well, here's the thing. We're about, in the last 100 years, we're about 1 degree higher than we were 100 years ago. Well, what difference does 1 degree make? You know, when it can sometimes be 65 degrees or it could be 105 degrees. A consistent 1 degree elevation in temperature is bad news for fires, because what it does is it creates a drier environment and sometimes a less humid environment, and that results in these big fires. And what's really interesting is, while we are up about 1 degree over the last 100 years, 3 states you would never imagine, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, are up about 3 degrees, and they have problems now with big fires.
The good news is that people are listening, and when they get the warning, thankfully, they are listening.